Hey, welcome into the Husker247 Podcast. I'm Mike Schaefer, joined by Brian Christopherson, Michael Brunt. It's a struggle over here, but we're bringing you some podcast content for the first time this week. It has been very, very busy, whether that be the portal that opened on Monday, whether that be assistant coaching changes, everything else. So a lot going on with Nebraska football. A great opportunity to dive into it. But I got to ask, Brunt, is it so cold in your house that you have to wear a stocking hat, or is this like one of those things that you do in the winter?
Both. It's drafty as hell over here. So that's the wonder of a almost 100-year-old house is this is like a wind tunnel just right through here. So it's usually stocking cap from November till basically by the time pitchers and catchers report, I'm switching back to hats.
I cannot imagine what that hair looks like when you take that thing off in the afternoon or the evening. So, in fact, I would actually like for you to send me a picture of it.
I will. It's bad. It's real bad.
I would imagine. All right. Nobody wants to talk about hat hair. Everybody wants to talk about Nebraska's new coaching staff, excuse me, on the defensive side of the ball. Let's just start with John Butler, named defensive coordinator. This has come up a few times. I've been asked about it on the radio a few times this week. I've continued to say that I wasn't overly surprised, but where did you guys kind of land on this with John Butler being named Nebraska's defensive coordinator, the interim tag removed and elevated to the role with Tony White leaving to Florida State? We'll start with Brian.
Yeah, I wasn't surprised because at the signing day press conference, I thought Matt Rhule, I mean, it was obvious he was still, thinking about it, but he also said he didn't want to stray far from what they had been doing. And he liked how it looked against Iowa in particular. And I don't know, you just kind of read the tea leaves too. Like John Butler had been pretty active, like on social media, and he had done their coach's radio interview with like a couple weeks left in the season. As I put it all together, I was sort of thinking he was the favorite. I think we've said that on this podcast, that if there were like Vegas odds, you'd probably put his name at the top. And I'd also make the point, I know some people would say they didn't maximize, in their opinion, on the back end of the defense this year. But I also think, let's say John Butler had been hired in the offseason, off his 2-3 decades resume, and the narrative that he was basically in a standoff and almost a Buffalo Bills DC and all these things. And they had such a top ranked pass defense the last 6-7 years in Buffalo. I think a lot of people off of that would have been like, oh yeah, they nailed it, like off the initial glance of the Google search of his work. So I think you got to look at the totality of what he's done as you consider this hire. And also that it has been an adjustment phase for him, I think. And he'd be honest about that, about getting back into the college game and like sort of how you evaluate players who are at a different level at age 18 than when they're 30 years old, which he was used to coaching for a decade.
And I don't know that he would use it as an excuse, but he arrived 7 weeks before the season began. Like he didn't get to go through spring. He didn't get to, so there's some elements in there where he was learning as much as his players were learning about him while the season was going on. And so there's an element in there where, things could get a little bit wonky. But Brunts, when you look at John Butler and Matt Rhule naming him as the defensive coordinator, BC kind of said that Rhule mentioned he didn't want to stray too far from what they were. Do you envision this is going to look a lot like it has the last 2 years?
I don't know. I mean, well, they were kind of trending away from there was a change in the way that they were covering on the back end this year that I think was largely driven by John Butler. I'm eager to see, do you see more 4-man fronts? Is it going to be, 3-man fronts? Nebraska for, as much as, you're kind of pigeonholed by the 3-3-5, they had a lot of 4-down linemen on their defense.
They played a multiple defense.
Yeah.
It wasn't just one look.
Yeah. So I think that won't change. I mean, I think the types of things that Matt Rhule is going to demand from his defensive coordinator are not going to change. And, what I'm I mean, we can get into this, but I think when everything kind of came out, I mean, the inclusion of Phil Snow being involved with the coaching organization and likely the defense in some form or fashion, that's interesting to me too, because obviously he's a long-time Rhule defensive coordinator, was brought in to kind of, take a look under the hood during the second bye week. So I think he's going to have a little bit of say in this as well for kind of what direction Nebraska ultimately goes defensively. And he's a guy that also has, throughout his career run multiple defenses and has kind of, shown to be a little bit malleable in terms of what he runs and, and where they've done it, especially considering, they were at Temple, then going to the wide open Big 12 at Baylor and then the NFL. So, I don't know that right now it would be like this is exactly what this is going to be in 2025, and it could be too. What we see in the bowl game could be a little bit different from what they ultimately play next year too.
Yeah, I do want to mention we're recording this before Matt Rhule talks on Thursday. I'm sure he's going to get asked specifically about this. But BC, if you had to guess, what do you think Phil Snow's role is actually going to be on this staff? It's sort of it's an unusual situation where he's not the defensive coordinator, but he's largely been Matt Rhule's right-hand man on defense for years. Is it a coaching emeritus type position? How do you see this thing kind of playing out? And I know I'm putting you in a tough spot because Rhule's going to talk about it in roughly an hour.
Yeah, we'll see for sure what Rhule says, but I just know, besides just looking at the fact that obviously they've been together at all these different stops, I've heard Phil Snow do interviews on this, so I feel comfortable saying this. They have a relationship where, as Snow put it, they're not afraid to go at each other two times and really challenge each other. And I just feel like probably in a big picture sense, Rhule just feels the benefit of just having him around. They've always had a real candid relationship, it seems like, as far as friends and being coaches, and like, this doesn't work, this does work. And I just think it's probably good too to have him there as John Butler is obviously a very experienced coach, but he hasn't been a DC, I guess you'd say, since 2013 with Penn State. That tag was attached to him. So it's been a while since he's been in that role. And I am guessing that John Butler had got a flavor of Phil Snow this season too, like through his consulting work and stuff. So you would hope that relationship is at least, crossed the first bridge a little bit as to what it's going to be. And obviously they can hopefully they can play ideas off of each other. I'm talking John Butler and Phil Snow a little bit, because he's a 68-year-old guy who has been the DC at a lot of places, had a lot of success. And so he'd be a wise guy to use as a sounding board for John Butler.
Brunson, to me, it seems kind of fascinating. You have Dana Holgorsen, who seems like your de facto coach on offense, and now you're adding Phil Snow along with John Butler. In some ways, is it even more of Matt Rhule trying to make himself in a CEO role type thing? That's an awkwardly phrased question, but I think you know where I'm trying to go with it.
Yeah, no, I think it probably frees him up to be a little bit more of that CEO overseer role. I mean, I think he was kind of that way anyways last year. I still think he's naturally going to kind of lean towards defense and being involved with that side of the ball, but it feels to me much more like, okay, like, Dana, here are the keys. Do what you're going to do. Like, they went out and hired, his preferred wide receivers coach that had been with him for a long time. Like, there's very much like this, like, okay, this is Dana Holgorsen's fiefdom, basically. And whereas, I'm sure he's going to have some say on defense. We do need to get a little bit of clarity, what Phil Snow's role will actually entail. It's hard to not imagine him, like, you have to imagine him being involved defensively, just given everything the fact that he was doing like pre-scouting work for Nebraska, last year, coming up here during the bye week. I mean, it just, maybe this frees Matt Rhule up more, to work on special teams too. I mean, there's a lot of things that need tinkering right now over in that program. And, I will say this though, and I think this kind of fits into this conversation about the hires. I think Nebraska has done a really good job and gone into the changes in college football with a really nice plan of how they're going to navigate these expanded coaching staffs. Like, you basically have you've got a former, multi-stop head coach running your offense. You're not going to ask him to go on the road and have to recruit and do all that other stuff. I mean, he can basically just sit in his office, watch film, talk to recruits when they're on campus, but you're not sending them out there. You've got Jamar Mosey, you've got Keith Williams, you've got Phil Simpson now, guys that are tied to specific areas that can go out and recruit, and you're not having to, you can kind of take more advantage, I guess, of the resources that a place like Nebraska has when you have this massive staff, and you're also accumulating this kind of brain trust of veteran coaching talent. So I think that's kind of also the storyline in all this is I think Nebraska went into these changes with a really kind of good idea of how they wanted to operate or ways that they could operate when those changes actually came down.
BC, we just heard Brunts mention Phil Simpson. We haven't had a chance to talk about him yet. He was here for the 23 season, left for an opportunity at Florida State, and is now back. And this is a guy that, I've said this before. I don't think Nebraska gets Cortez Mills if they hadn't hired Phil Simpson in December of 22, because he kind of helped foster and start that relationship that then Nebraska continued on and was ultimately able to get the commitment. Now he's going to be back as an outside linebackers coach. This is a guy who played for Matt Rhule. He strikes me as someone who is going to be an effective recruiter in the Miami, Florida area, and probably everywhere, but in particular is very well connected to a number of high schools down there and a number of players. What did you make of the Phil Simpson announcement?
I think it's big. I think as much as we talk about with high school guys on signing day picking a program over like a relationship with a coach, that still matters a ton. And I think it's going to matter too. It's going to be a big sidebar of like transfer portal stuff, like, those connections that maybe certain players who are in the portal have or had with like a Jamar Mosey or somebody like that, or even like played against them or knew him in the area. And so when you have guys like, Mosey down in the Kansas City area doing work, and now you got Phil Simpson back in Miami, we saw what they got done with that crew from last year. I mean, that was one of the most promising things of the 2024 season for Nebraska football was the Miami 5, as I call them. And
Miami 5.
You can knock on wood on this because who knows, things change by the hour, but it does feel like those guys, there's some energy around those guys still within the program. Like I know Shavers and Amari Sanders have talked about being all in, and Ja'Cory Barney obviously is a huge piece. And even, Willis McGahee, I think 24/7 Sports has Princewell like as one of the top portal guys that's out there. Willis McGahee was challenging him for reps here in Lincoln, playing more reps in some games. So
arguably more effective.
Yeah, he probably was. And so there's a lot to like out of that group, and they're going to all know Phil Simpson. They're going to have a lot of respect for him. I talked with Cortez Mills for a profile about him, but we did talk about Phil Simpson, and he said how to him and his mom, Coach Simpson was like he was their solid rock. Like they just trusted him. And so I think he's that way with a lot of guys in that area. And, now they're bringing in a D-line coach that has connections in Miami and Florida too, in Terry Bradden. And I just talked with DiCaprio Boodle about him because he played with them for the Chiefs. And he said that guy knows ball and was like way more involved than you would think like an assistant D-line coach might be with the Chiefs. So I think they have done well with their hires, but also the regional strongholds they can have with recruiting with them is a big bonus.
Brunts, I'm fairly certain the Matt Rhule defensive line coach tree is just going to always go to the assistant defensive line coach in the NFL route. He had success with Terrence Knighton. Now you have Terry Bradden. BC mentioned that he was more involved than what people might think. I personally think that it's never a bad thing to be aligned with a guy who's been around that much success, and Steve Spagnuolo and Chris Jones and George Karlaftis. And I know you're a Broncos guy, but honestly, it seems like there should be some excitement over this defensive line coach hire, even though it's a guy that isn't a known name. Though I would also point out known names in the college profession are not that likely when you're hiring assistant coaches. I mean, people get really excited about specific names, and it just doesn't ever happen.
You're trying to get me to say good things about the Chiefs, aren't you? Like,
you don't have to say good things about the Chiefs, but you can opine on Terry Bradden if you'd like.
Nebraska was hiring like an assistant from the Packers. I would take that question. I wouldn't expect you guys to say nice things about the Packers.
Fair. All right. BC, would you like to answer the question on behalf of Brunts?
I'll take it. I'll take it. I want to answer this question. Let me take a.
So you can be a neutral reporter right now.
Let me put the blindfold on and take a whack at this pinata. So no, I mean, I think there is a lot to be said for having the Kansas City Chiefs on your resume. I mean, for as much as it pains me to say, that's a group that has figured out how to win games. They've figured out how to win close games. They seem to have a very good culture and also a defense that has gotten markedly better over the last few years and not been kind of a boat anchor for where they were trying to go. So, yeah, I mean, that's a big deal. Certainly the ties to South Florida are intriguing. Brian can talk about that too. I mean, with having talked to Boodle about it, but I mean, it feels a little bit like, you go back a couple of years ago where Terrence Knighton gets hired and doesn't have, has some NFL experience. I mean, this is kind of a similar type pro resume in some ways as an assistant defensive line coach. But I mean, he's already on social media. He's already, it seems like a very high energy guy. And so I'm intrigued by what this can be. I mean, when you've got a lot of people from various places, and especially from Kansas City, saying like, okay, this is a big deal and a big hire and a good hire. I definitely take notice of that. So, maybe he can bring some of that Chiefs magic in close games, one-score games to Lincoln and get things changed a little bit. I don't know if the referees come with him to Lincoln or how that works, but I'm very intrigued by the hire. So that's about as good as I can really get in there for Kansas City.
BC, there's a lot left to be done with this coaching staff. I mean, we don't have answers on who's going to be the defensive backs coach. We don't know if everyone that's there is going to be returning on the offensive side of the ball. How do you kind of size this up? Because it feels like we're only halfway through this staff being set. Does that seem like a fair characterization?
Yeah, maybe. I think it's fair to just say we don't know right now, because it does always feel like, even before it got this crazy in college football, there was always like the phase 1 and then phase 2 of coaching movement season. And there's the phase 1 that always happens in December, like before the bowl games, like in the 2 weeks right after. And then there's sort of that period where it's like, all right, let's get back to the football for a little bit. And with the bowls, and that happens. And then that settles. Along the way, there's some coaching move you didn't expect that causes this chain reaction, which always leads into like February. It gets to be like February or sometimes March before the waters completely settle. And so just on that alone, you would say there could still be stuff. And, it's fair to ask Rhule too. like what wants to see out of special teams going forward and like what direction he wants there. Because there's a lot of questions about that with the year they had. I know they're looking hard in the portal at certain spots that can help with that. And sometimes it can be as simple as like your 2 or 3 main spots are really good and that makes everything else good. But that's something you keep an eye on. And like you said, I don't know that the offensive staff is just settled right now. I'm not just going to go along with that thought.
Yeah. Let's dive into the portal. Brunch, you've been doing a lot of the coverage for us on this here the last few days. Give me 2 or 3 names that sort of stand out for you as either they're planning to visit Nebraska, have either already been to Nebraska, or they're tied to Nebraska.
Yeah, it's a lot, and we've done a few years of portal coverage, and it's interesting. Like you kind of look at what visits are set up, and guys expected to come in this day, and then it just feels like there's a lot more of like jockeying with the visits this year than maybe what there's been in the past. I think part of that's need. I think part of that's asking price fluctuates quite a bit. But Nebraska's been active. I mean, I think when you look at kind of the position groups that they've targeted so far, wide receiver is definitely one that they're looking at pretty hard. Defensive end and edge, that's a group that I think they're looking at. Linebacker, certainly. And then like Brian said, I mean, you're seeing Nebraska, looking at a long snapper, which I think everybody would be on board with Nebraska adding for next season. They're going to bring in a grad or a transfer punter from Washington for an official visit this weekend as another kind of way to bolster that group, which was, the punting was okay last year, but needs to be better. So, one guy I'm at least intrigued by, exchanged messages with him last night, Cameron Olds, an edge from Kent State. Started his career at Buffalo, had a great year last year, for Kent State, and is now in the portal. He picked up quite a few offers. He says he's going to be at Nebraska on Saturday for an official visit. Georgia Tech is also involved there. One other position group I should mention, Nebraska's been pretty active with offering an offensive lineman as well. With having to replace Bryce Benhart, Ben Scott, kind of reshuffle things. I mean, if you think, Justin Evans, if he's going to be your center next year, then you need to find some guard help as well there. So it's been, especially the last 24 hours or so, they started hosting visitors yesterday. Sorry, I've got my list here very slowly popping up. But I mean, if you guys had like 3 positions that you're like, this is where Nebraska really has to go and nail this position group. I mean, it's across the board, but what 2 or 3 really stand out for you guys?
I definitely think defensive line with some of the guys that they lost. We'll get into it here in a little bit. Getting Keona Davis back, I think, was really good for Nebraska. But then, to me, it's defensive line and then wide receiver. I think it was imperative that they had a veteran wide receiver that can be part of that group along with Ja'Cory Barney and Jalen Lloyd and some of the young guys that are just going to be breaking in. And then the one that we really haven't mentioned, and I'm sort of surprised because I haven't really seen Nebraska tied to anyone, but I think it's imperative that they add talent there, is at safety. I just don't know. I don't know that I feel great about Nebraska's secondary as it stands right now. Now, maybe they really like their young guys. Maybe Ramirez Stewart or someone's going to blow up for them. I don't know what it is, but you're kind of had a run of veteran safety play that you're now on the other side of. And so I would be curious what the ultimate plan is there. But I do think it's important that they're bringing in specialists and that they're bringing in offensive linemen and things of that nature. But the defensive backfield and safety in particular is a spot that I think there's a lot of guys in the portal, and I think it would behoove Nebraska to add someone. But we haven't really seen them linked to anybody, so maybe they won't.
I think they need a couple backers too. I mean, you think about like that position group, and you're excited about like Shavers and maybe some guys upcoming, but John Bullock was a big spot in that defense last season. He was maybe, aside from maybe Ty Robinson, you could put him up there as like one of the MVPs of the defense. So you might need a couple guys to kind of come in, and that you can't take for granted like a Stephon Thompson in November is giving you reps and stuff like that. So you kind of need to fill that with maybe a guy or two. I know Omar Graham was a name that was linked to Nebraska from Florida State. I don't know where that one's at, but there
doesn't appear he's visiting anymore.
Yeah, so that one's maybe off the table. So we'll see where they go from there. But obviously that shows you there's an intrigue in adding maybe a guy or two at that spot.
Yeah, a couple names just real quick on that. They had Jonah Pace from Central Michigan, defensive tackle.
Yep.
He was on campus yesterday. They've been linked very strongly to Dominic Giudice. He's a Michigan offensive lineman. Both of those guys, I believe, have 1 year left. So just kind of like a senior type piece on each side of the ball. Eric Rivers from Florida International, a wide receiver, said he was going to visit Nebraska on the 15th and 16th, among other trips to Miami, Penn State, and Colorado. He's a guy that, when I said, visits have been very flexible, the visits that he was set to make a week ago have very much shifted this week as his profile has kind of changed as well. And then Washington punter Jack McAllister, 3-year starter there. Nebraska's going to host him this weekend as well. So it's just going to be, I think, a steady drumbeat of a couple guys here, a couple guys there over the next couple weeks as Nebraska gets ready for that bowl game. I didn't mean to cut you off, Schaefer. I was just finally got my stuff to load.
You're good. I just wanted to say, as like a small mini vent session, I find it incredibly stupid on our message board when I go in there into a thread on a transfer player, and one of the first comments is, "Oh, Central Michigan, that'll really help." Okay, great. Because definitely Cam Scadaboo didn't come from Sacramento State and go to Arizona State. We don't have a sport where it's littered with players that have transferred now from smaller schools that have had success elsewhere. So you need to add to your roster. Not everybody's going to be a superstar, but if you can get good players, that helps you. And if any program in the country has a good idea that just because they came from an Alabama or an Ohio State doesn't mean that they're actually going to help you, it would be Nebraska, who brought in guys like Tyreek Johnson and Kane Williams and the defensive lineman from Alabama. So like where someone is coming from is not all that big of a deal as much as how they can help you. So I just want to get that off my chest because I find that to be absolutely idiotic. Also, Nebraska is a 6-6 football team. They can use help from any program in the country. And
it's an interesting conversation because I've talked to some player personnel folks at other schools, and I think there's value in guys who are transferring up, if that makes sense. Like guys that have production at past like FCS schools, lower group of 5 schools, things like that. Guys that have gotten it done there. I think there's this kind of growing comfort, I guess, in some situations of like if we're gonna add a guy that we need to help us soon, it makes more sense to get like a Samori Toure that's had that production at a place like Montana or something like that. And if it translates, I think you can kind of figure out pretty quickly if it's going to translate. I mean, Texas Tech last night got commitments from a safety turned linebacker from North Dakota State and an offensive.
He was an absolute stud. That's one of the best gets that anybody has gotten in the entirety of the transfer portal so far. And there would be people that are like, North Dakota State, how's that going to help them?
I like the message board guy voice, by the way.
He's a big dumb idiot. That's the message board guy voice.
But they also got an interior offensive lineman from Illinois State. I mean, I think there's 2 ways to go about it. Like I think you can certainly go and get really high profile transfers. And I think you have to do that at a place like Nebraska. But I think there's also a time and a place to find value from guys that have had success at places in the FCS and also the group of five. And I think as this kind of goes along, I think there's also some people at programs in the Power Four that are kind of waking up to that fact too, or at least getting a little bit more comfortable with that.
Yeah. No, it's got to be a blend. Like for the lack of a better example, if you can add a Williams Nwaneri from Missouri and you can get a Jonah Pace, it's going to help your defensive line. One of those guys might be more helpful in 2025 than the other, but you're trying to add. Like I don't think that Nebraska can scoff at where anybody's coming from if they can help make their team better or fill it out in terms of depth. And I think you're absolutely correct that one of the market inefficiencies was trying to find some of these FCS guys that probably should have been in the FBS or could excel in the FBS. And so I think you're starting to see more programs take a look at some of the top FCS players or group of five players. And I mean, if a guy can help you, he can help you. That's all that really matters. So we'll see kind of how that all plays out. I mentioned I want to finish with this. I know we're tight on time. BC, Emmett Johnson, Keona Davis, both returned. Your thoughts?
I'll start with Keona Davis. When he initially, or when it was reported that he was planning to go in the portal, that one hit me the hardest just because I feel like he has great potential. Already had size that you rarely see as a true freshman. I didn't feel like he just took a lot of lumps even when he was playing. I actually thought I think I mentioned to you guys in our text that he played 90 snaps. And I think someone said they're surprised it was not higher, or they thought it was actually higher. And that's sort of how I felt too. But I thought that was a big deal that he said he's coming back. It's a big deal for Terry Bradden that he's got that in his room to work on. And Emmett Johnson, I feel like that that calmed the waters a little bit when he said he was returning. I think a lot of people wanted to see can he build on the last 3 games of the year he had in Holgerson's offense, because it was the best we've ever seen him play. And I think Emmett Johnson has proven he's a good back. And now in 25 with Holgerson's offense, let's see if he can be a great back. Can he make that next step? And I know he likes these challenges of making guys miss. You heard Rhule talk about it all year. You can get those 8-yard runs, but can somebody start to produce those plays where you make that second level, third level miss and everybody in the stadium standing up at the same time on a 55-yard, touchdown hit. So that's the next part for Emmett Johnson for me, if he can do that. And then he can't. The question is, were we just watching the beginning of his rise, or is that sort of where it is? So if it's the beginning of the rise, it's going to be really exciting in 25.
All right. Anything else you guys want to add before we shut things down? I know you got to get to the Matt Rhule presser, so it appears no one is saying anything. So
I said good things about the Chiefs. I think I've said enough today.
I apologize for putting you in that spot. Truly. All right. For Brian Christopherson, for Michael Bruntz, for Mike Schaefer, we are Husker247. Be sure to check out everything we have going on at Husker247.com. Plenty of portal coverage, plenty of coverage in general bowl coverage. Nebraska is a bowl-eligible team. We're going to have some practice updates and highlights and all of that stuff as Matt Rhule speaks here on Thursday. So be sure to check out everything we have going on at Husker247. We'll catch you next time.